lion. Of the conquering lion, most lighter, you're the only one we can rely on. Of the conquering lion, most lighter, you're the only one we can rely on. In a press, in a jungle, in a.
All right, so always greetings as we usually do here. Yefdeyah here, RastafariRenaissance.com, and we had to actually bring again another, I guess you can say, archival lecture, which is partaken, of course, by Dr. Arthur Lewis once again, and being set up quite well here, speaking on, again, the Sino-African trade relations. And we're kind of picking this up again from, our long stint that we had there on Discipleship Radio with the Sino-African relations as far as the end of 2018 had begun. But we didn't get a chance to delve even more so into, a lot of the things that have been going on from times past on up until this point, which is another great moment in showing why we are seeing so much development, so much commotion, so much even so controversy whenever a lot of these instances come, into play. And it's a lot on both sides. There's a lot of corruption and there's a lot of good being done. So it's all of the muck and mire gets mixed in between with a lot of what is being presented. But of course, the controversy is always the first to come to its head, and it always seems to show itself more fervently than anything else. And even so, with most of the situations which we are seeing, especially on the African side of most of these trade deals, this quote-unquote debt trap that most ones have coined it as, it still relays and shows us a change and a shift in the time periods, and also within the greater scheme of things in which are to come. So again, I get very comfortable here. We'll have this in two parts, and hopefully once we'll gain a bit more insight and be able to calculate better analysis when dealing with this entire situation as a whole.
Let's get it. Let's get it. Let's get it.
I've been hustling really, really hard.
Yes.
Get up on my ass, start making some moves.
Come on.
Two and two together, start paying my dues. I gotta get up for it. Stand up in this world.
Good evening. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the community organization here, Brother Nooney and African Echoes in the Communiversity, for giving us the opportunity to present the material to you. We call this lecture, or we're going to title it, The 21st Century, the African-Asian Century. And we're going to do a presentation that consists of reading materials, slides, and discussion. What I'd like to do is to introduce Professor James Allen so that he could come to give us an overview of this African-Asian century, the 21st century. And after he gives his overview, then we'll get into the formal part of the lecture. And when we finish the discussion, the material and the slides, and myself and Professor Allen will be here to entertain questions.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. I'm going to try. Let me just start out by saying that Europeans have been running roughshod over the world since the 15th century. Britain, the British and the American industrial revolutions enabled the Europeans to advance from being primarily buyers of colonial products to become sellers in search of markets for their machine-produced goods. During the last 50 years, the Europeans have become debtor nations. Explain that as we go along. They have become debtor nations who are reeling and resisting the inevitability of the 21st century, and that is evidencing the ascendancy of Asia and Africa. In the present century, the Europeans have found it extremely difficult to colonize information. We know that they colonize nations, peoples, resources. One of the things they have been unable to do is simply colonize information. That freedom to impart information and understanding is going to be the purpose of our talk this afternoon. By studying our history and that of the colonizers, we have found the keys for survival and advancement in the 21st century. Prior to Dr. Lewis sharing with you some of the evidence that points to this trend, let me examine some of the key points that characterize the previous Euro-American hegemony over the world's two largest continents. European expansion into Asia spread in four directions. Again, the two largest continents are Asia and Africa. European expansion into Asia spread in four directions. First into Serbia, the Far East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And this was primarily a Russian expansion after the Crimean War of 1856. Britain had already colonized India. So we're looking at a combined onslaught of the Asian continent. The Russians, and then later the Russians and the British. In 1860, the Anglo-French soldiers extended and their influence and entered the city of Peking in China. And at that time, Russia took over what's called Manchuria and attempted to acquire Korea. The Dutch moved into Indonesia. The French went into Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The British went into Malaysia, Burma, and Borneo. And Japan had wrested control of Korea from the Russians. And so this large continent, we see this imperialist rivalry going on. And we're going to see the same thing as it applies to the African continent as well. But it was size, the size of China, and the size of imperialist rivalry, which prevented any one country from dominating China. But all of the Europeans wanted a piece of China. You have to stay with me and follow this brief scenario in terms of some things that went on that relate particularly to China. The British brought tea from China. And as the British were purchasing tea from China, they began to expend large amounts of their silver supply. And so, okay, we're buying tea, we like tea, and of course, we are retailing tea. We're buying it wholesale, we're selling it all over the world as British tea, although it's coming from China. But we're spending money, we're spending our silver supply because we're buying it from China. In order to offset spending large amounts of silver for tea, they began to trade for the tea. And what they used to trade for the tea in China was opium. So they now bring in opium from India to secure the tea from China. Now China is now purchasing and receiving large amounts of opium from the British via India. This led to a loss of the Chinese silver supply. Stay with me. They are now purchasing the opium. So the silver that they were acquiring as a result of the British purchasing the tea, they're now losing it because they are now purchasing the opium. Led to a loss of their silver supply and an unfavorable trade balance, or imbalance, with the British. Plus you have the physical and mental deterioration of the Chinese population taking place, particularly with the opium users and all the attendant problems that come from drug use in one society. As a result of that, China banned the importation of opium. They confiscated the opium that existed in the country, closed down all the warehouses, and forbid foreigners from trading in their key port city of Canton. This led to the first Opium War of 1840 to 42. The British invade China and take over control of the key port city of Canton, Shanghai, and Nanking. And the intent, of course, is to exacerbate the opium trade, to force opium on the Chinese people. This invasion resulted in the Chinese having to cede the city of Hong Kong to the British. And it also opened the door for other Europeans to now come into China, particularly the United States, France, and Russia. And these 5 nations keep popping up throughout the centuries. The United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. 5 permanent nations of the Security Council. We'll come to that as we go along as well. Peasant rebellions began to take place in China, particularly beginning in 1850 through 64. Some refer to it as the Boxer Rebellion because they were led by individuals, priests, who were studying the martial arts. This rebellion takes place, and now there's a concerted attempt by the Europeans to put down the rebellion. France and England jointly conspire to put down this rebellion. And what it results in is that a puppet government now controls China. The Chinese government is now what's referred to as indirect rule, where the British are ruling China through hand-picked Chinese officials. You know, the classic example of indirect rule that can take place throughout the colonial world. Britain, France, and the United States further penetrated China, and they were followed by Germany, Italy, Denmark, Spain, Belgium, and Austria-Hungary. All of these folks now embark upon what's called an open door to China, an open door to the largest country in the Asian mainland. They legalize the opium trade.
Rastafari on the Brink with Lidj Yefdi from RastafariRenaissance.com is indeed brought to you in part by ones, especially the supporters and fellowship members of Rastafari Groundation.org, along with the Lion of Judah Society Incorporated. Indeed, stay tuned for much more reasonment and fulfillment.
And reduce tariffs on European goods coming into China. Only one nation in Asia would escape European colonization, and that would be the nation of Japan. And we'll talk about this as we go along as well. The only nation. And of course, Japan would become an imperialist, a capitalist imperialist nation in its own right, and that is why they were able to forestall this colonization. But we also know that they were able to defend themselves and defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. But these same European countries that had banked on China now turn their eyes towards the African continent as well. It was the same imperialist rivalry that would take place where the same nations that had banked on China now came together to prevent rivalry from breaking out once again and held a conference in Berlin beginning in May of 1884 and ending in February of 1885. And that is the infamous Berlin Conference where the Europeans not only decided how they were going to carve up Africa and parcel it out amongst themselves, but they also met and determine how they would continue their domination over Asia as well. So this one conference resulted in these European nations taking over the two largest continents of the earth. This would lead, of course, to an event that would take place in 1914, which I like to refer to as the First Imperialist War, where the agreements that have been made at this conference have fallen apart. They fell apart. Folks went to war with one another. This resulted in a new balance of power for a time, and the Japanese were left out of this scheme of things. They were not allowed to participate. Although they were a capitalist imperialist nation in their own right, and the fact that they defeated the Russians in 1904 led directly to the overthrow of the Tsarist family in Russia and the culmination of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. But during this period, of course, again, we see the ascendancy of the United States government and their control over the international capitalist system, and the need, therefore, for continued exertion of that control and influence. Things went along well after that war was over. The United States began to flex its muscles, began to create a new organization to perpetuate its ascendancy, and that was the League of Nations. Unfortunately, that fell apart. Unfortunately, the little colonel from Germany would rise. Unfortunately, the Japanese began to flex its muscles in Asia and began to talk about Asia for the Asians and that everyone else need to go. The Japanese began to attempt to make that a reality and vamp on the British and vamp on the Americans, as evidenced by what happened in December 7, 1941. But we need to look at what happened in 1941, having its origins in 1933 as part of this imperialist rivalry. One of the major reasons why the Japanese were involved in trying to secure markets and resources for itself is that they had been left out of the Berlin Conference. They quit the League of Nations and decided to go their own way. And one of the key things that drove the Japanese pursuit during this era was one of the key things that is dominant in the world economy today. That is that pursuit of black gold, oil. The other thing that we need to recognize and keep in mind after this time period was that the United States began this unique practice after the culmination of the Second Imperialist War, where they aided their former foes. They rebuilt the Japanese economy. They rebuilt the German economy at the expense of their allies. That's something that needs to be understood just a little. They rebuilt the Japanese and the German economies to the extent that the Japanese and German economies now outproduce the economies of their former allies. The reason they rebuilt those economies was the same reason that the British were in opposition to the slave trade. The British were in opposition to the slave trade because they knew that slavery is what accumulated their wealth and spurred the Industrial Revolution. And as a result of that, they did not want any competition. So they were against the slave trade, not because it was wrong or evil or immoral or anything like that. They didn't want anyone else to go through an industrial revolution and be in a position to compete with them. Likewise, the Yankees, the Americans, coming out of the Second Imperialist War, did not want to have to compete with its former allies for control over colonial markets. So they financed the rebuilding of the economies of the folks they had just defeated, Germany and Japan, and were in a position to control those economies so that their allies, their former friends, would not be in a position to compete with them. Now, they gave aid to their former friends. And we know the three organs that were created to assist their former friends. Well, actually four. One was the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe. But the others were the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, now known as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that's more commonly known as the World Bank. These were the vehicles that were used to keep their allies in a position where they would be dependent upon the Americans, because the money that was given to them was only money that was to be utilized to purchase American goods. So if you're not going to purchase American goods with this aid, then you can't receive the aid. As a result, the United States became the greed, the avarice of the United States in particular for new markets and raw materials and a cheap supply of labor and new areas for investment of their finance capital led to a diminished manufacturing capability. They only began to focus on the markets. They only began to focus on cheap sources of labor. They only began to focus on new areas for direct investment of their capital. This led to, again, a diminished ability in the manufacturing process. So the manufacturing capability of the United States began to diminish. And as a result of the agencies for lending money, all they were concerned with, therefore, was how to secure money, how to make money by lending folks, well, it's loan shark. They were only interested in loan shark. And therefore, the manufacturing capability and the control of raw materials that would be fashioned into finished products, it now became okay for that to take place abroad. So that the companies, the businesses, the corporations, now it's cool for them to set up shop in the so-called third world. The manufacturing can take place there. All they want is the finished products, and all they want is the money that comes from the finished products. But the finished product can be made somewhere else. All we want is our continued monies that derive from the result of our giving you money, lending you money all throughout the years and all throughout the millennium. So that as far as Asia and Africa is concerned, dependency is what accumulates capital for the new American robber barons. That dependency, all we want is the capital coming to the United States. We don't care about jobs. The jobs can leave and go somewhere else. Jobs are not stable. People go on strike, make that stuff somewhere else. We just want to, we will just control folks' financing. As a result of not focusing on the manufacturing capability, the only two things that the United States now, and Europe in particular, the way they accumulate capital is through debt and oil. We've said numerous times that oil is the lifeblood of modern industrialized society. Kerosene, gasoline, oil for your cars, oil for heating. Oil is a primary component of the plastic industry. Oil is used in chemical fertilizers. Oil is utilized in the whole pill industry. Electric generators are being run by oil, etc. So oil is the lifeblood. And because that is their thing, that is their business. You got a Texas oil man in the White House. His number 2 man is an oil man. His national security advisor is an oil woman. Oil is what they're interested in. And that has characterized and shaped U.S. foreign policy for the second part of the 20th century. And that is where they're going into for the 21st century. They want to control the lifeblood of modern industrialized societies. And will do anything as we see events transpiring in Western Asia, in Central Asia, West Africa, North Africa, South America, anyone who's sitting on top of this black gold. The attempt now is to control that gold by controlling the political economy of the nations that have it. And if that means killing people, if that means making that economy scream, they have evidence that they are willing and able and ready to do that. But it also means that other people around the world are seeing what their power is resting upon. And they've seen historically ways and means of how to fight them. Because people have been resisting and fighting for the last 400 and 500 years. And it is that unity, that coming together of people, that we see manifesting itself in the 21st century. The latter part of the 20th century, the primary books that we were reading were Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and on a political level, people were reading Mao's Little Red Book, quotations from Chairman Mao. Those will no longer serve us for the 21st century. The book that I'm here advocating today that will serve our interests for the 21st century is one that you're going to have to order from Havana. The world economic and social crisis, its impact on the underdeveloped countries, its somber prospects, and the need to struggle if we are to survive, authored by Fidel Castro. You cannot find this book in the United States. It's published by the Cuban government, and it was a report to the 7th Summit Conference of Non-Aligned Countries. Things that we see manifesting now, that Dr. Lewis is going to talk about, things that he talks about here in terms of the necessity of unity amongst African nations, and the formation of the African Union is a step in that direction. Even unity amongst the European nations as they try to get the American monkey off of their back. Other nations in Asia, other nations in South America, the Caribbean, that unity and depending and relying on one another, and begin to seriously think this notion that oil and only oil alone and the need to pay your debt is the most important thing to do. Fidel said, forget about that. Focus on the unity, later for the debt. With folks defaulting on the debt, that control of the international economic system goes by the wayside. It's held together by paper. When that goes, the countries unite with one another and begin to barter once again and do what they feel is in their own best interest. And later for making debt payments, we will begin to see some changes. So I just wanted to set that framework and that tone for Dr. Lewis's presentation, and we'll have a question and answer period immediately following. Thank you very much.
I thank Professor Allen for giving a historical overview of what we're going to attempt to do here. And I think it was important to have Professor Allen and others has brought it to our attention that he opened with that framework so that we can understand that what we have to do is going to be based upon what he indicated that Fidel Castro indicated. And so that we're clear that it's not going to be accomplished. Us Africans and the Asians coming back to world power is not going to be accomplished with a vote, demonstrations, or anything. Not that he said that he can't do that. And he gave you a historical background that spanned at least 300 or 400 years to show you where you are now. So that when we talk about the 21st century being an African-Asian century, you're going to begin to see this shift into the power centers going to Asia first and then to Africa. The shift away from America and Europe. And without the background that he gave you, much of what I am going to attempt to give you would be difficult to understand. But because he framed it in such a way from a historical point of view, and over 400 years, to see the pattern and you see the behavior of different people, hopefully it'll make it easier as we present the material to understand this transition. Because people say, how is Africa going to become powerful again? How is Asia going to become powerful again? You can't understand it unless you go back to the history as he just presented it and begin to come up. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to bring the material to you. And what I have material here that consists of a handout that you have. And in this handout I have a number of articles here that I will be reading to you in which you do not have. And in the presentation will be consistent of me reading a few articles to you, some of which you have, others you don't. We're going to then bring in some slides to illustrate what we're trying to point to. And we're going back to the reading material, then we're going to come back to the slides, and then we're going to have the question and answer. Yes, it's there someplace. We will attempt to make this presentation in about an hour and 15 minutes. So we get a gauge on our time so that we have time for question and answer. So it might be better if we make the presentation and then the question and answer, because it'll stretch it too long if we do question and answer in between. What Professor Allen indicated to you in his historical outline, what I'm going to try to do is give some specifics to illustrate what he meant. And the specifics are going to deal with today. So we're not really going back past 2003. He brought you up to 2003, up to the 21st century. So what we're going to do is try to bridge the gap between the 20th, the end of what they call the 20th, and beginning the 21st century. And what we're going to try to do is give you a little snapshot of what is happening in the United States. Then we're going to shift over to Asia, Western Asia, where all this fight over all this oil is. And we're going to go and deal a little bit with globalization. And then we're going to end up with what is happening in Northeast Asia with the Chinese, the Japanese, the 2 Koreas, and Russia. And part of that, and in between that, we're going to deal with the beginning link of the Africans with the Asians as exemplified by Mugabe and Addis Ababa, dealing with China. So we're going to go on to present. Just to touch on one little aspect that Professor Allen mentioned.
Our beta testing site is now up for your perusal. There will be products added on a daily basis, so those looking to support our platform here on Anchor FM, as well as our many other platforms, feel free to support Rastafari on the Brink by visiting gashanator.onuniverse.com.
When the Europeans began to lose power after what they call World War II, and America began to its ascendancy, the Europeans, headed by America, set up 3 organizations to dominate Africans and Asians. Professor Allen mentioned it. That's the World Bank, IMF, the loan shark to economically drain you. That's the UN to politically control you. And the NATO, with the United States, to militarily control you. So by looking through the history, you can begin to see how we're going to come back to power. So I'm going to start with the reading, and we're going to accelerate the speech pattern so that we can move it. The first handout that you have, I'm going to read to you. And the purpose of reading is to let you hear it, but the individuals who are going to get the video have to hear this material. So the reading accomplishes those two functions. Most of the materials, not all the materials, taken from periodicals, magazines, newspapers that are published for the public. And the purpose for that is so that a lot of people have credibility to what you're saying, not that it's necessarily correct, when they see it coming from the media that's put out to the masses of people. The other way is to let individuals know this is a thinking pattern for you to take into consideration. So they said, well, Dr. Lewis didn't make this up. This material is just something presented to you as a way to get you to think. So when you think about what Professor Allen said is, are we going into the 21st century? Are we really coming to power? What are some of the examples of what he's saying to you? So we're going to get started here by saying, the first article comes from the New York Times, November 18th, 2003, and is dealing with outsourcing. And in it has a little cartoon that shows an individual which is supposed to be in the United States of America. On his back is a horizontal platform, and there are a number of things that this individual is supporting. And it says, for those who don't have it, and for the camera, it says the deficit. This is of the United States. It says, who's jumping on your back to put this deficit on you? The energy subsidies, the new entitlements, the farm subsidies, the Iraq war, and pork. And it says here, and this is trying to give some material to illustrate what Professor Allen said about this decline of the United States and the ascendancy of Africa and Asia. Says, as the economy bounces back, this is according to this individual, even Silicon Valley job market is showing signs of revival, but it has a long way to go. Employees are being extremely picky. The few jobs being offered pay less than they once did, and they do not come with the bountiful benefits and sterling opportunities of the 1990 boom. We go down, we're reading just what is underlined. The continued displacement of basic level technology jobs overseas in the boomerang effect as companies use the new technology largely invented here to sharply increase the productivity is keeping employment down and salary markedly below the boom level. Job losses have slowed considerably. This is the conclusion of a report due on Wednesday from the American Electronics Association in Washington, D.C., which found that the information technology sector is expected to lose 240,000 jobs this year, 2003. Most of them earlier in the year compared with the 540,000 jobs last year. So they said you have lost almost 800,000 jobs just in technology. So when you start telling about this boom that's coming, as Professor Allen said, where are these jobs going? While some established companies are still cutting jobs, at the same time, many have worried about the prospects of jobs flowing to places like India and China. Forster Research Project projects that by the year 2005, as many as 588,000 service jobs now held by Americans will shift abroad. By the year 2015, the nation will probably lose about 3.3 million jobs overseas. But it is not clear how many of these will be in technology. And they go on to talk about productivity. Second article we'll read is an article you do not have in your folder, but we'll read it. Each of the articles take about 2 minutes, but it's very important to illustrate what Professor Allen has indicated. It says a growing export white-collar work. So now we know they're moving the service jobs out, the manufacturing jobs out. Now they're working on the service jobs and the white-collar jobs. And it says here, this is from Newsday, December 20th, 2003. Big but large bank financial institutions have jumped on the outsourcing bandwagon, lured by the expectation of deep savings and improved efficiency in their products. Smaller lenders like Greenpoint also are flowing overseas. Such outsourcing ventures, however, are chock full of controversies and risks for the companies, the workers, and the economy generally. Coming after a big shift in manufacturing jobs to Asia and Latin America, politicians, economists, and advocates for the U.S. worker worry that white-collar positions, which will follow, never to return. In the past, the U.S. tended to move consumer service call center jobs overseas. Today, however, higher level data processing, securities, research, even human resources are being outsourced. There will be fewer high-paying jobs here as more companies outsource them to other countries, said the individual here. Ultimately, it will hurt the New York economy. Abraham, the individual who is writing this article, says, declined to mention specific outsourcing. They're dealing with the large banks. On the face, the amount of money companies may save by sending jobs to India and other countries is quite large, experts say. They noted that India boasts a highly educated, English-speaking, working class that works for wages much lower than the United States. A call center position in India, for example, will average about $2,200, where the same position in the United States will run $28,000 to $40,000. The world's top 100 financial companies will send about 2 million data processing jobs out of the United States to Europe, Japan, and Singapore, and Hong Kong by the year 2008, representing about 15% of the financial sector. The companies will transfer $356 billion in costs offshore in the next 5 years, resulting in $138 billion savings. Just to show you, as Professor Allen is telling you, the trend of what is happening. I'm going to read you a short article, which you do not have again. We're taking you through the financial structure of the United States as we see it. And it's from the New York Times, December 7, 2003. It says, pension trouble equals savings and loans collapse. And we're going to read just briefly from the few underlined. And it says here, so we're going to give you an idea. Now we know where your job's going, we know where your pension is going. The collapse of the savings and loans industry in the 1980s is being evoked more and more to describe the possible danger ahead for the ailing pension fund. If even the sharp-eyed Alan Greenspan had failed to spot the saving and loan crisis in the making, what can be said about the way Washington is handling the $1.6 trillion in your pension fund? See how much money is still left of the 44 million Americans. The savings and loans system didn't melt down until 1989, but its trouble started a decade previously. Years of inaction between these years made it eventual. That's why the federal government never fund adequately the regulatory agencies that watch these guys so that they can steal everything. If employees were forced to pay every penny right now, their fund would be $350 billion deficit. So of the $1.6 trillion that's supposed to be there, about a quarter isn't there that they know of. That doesn't even mean a $350 billion bailout or any bailout is looming, but the numbers suggest that if the pension system melts down, taxpayers will be on the hook for hundreds of billions of dollars. The agency that insures pension, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, is now technically insolvent. The federal government is insolvent already, having taken over a number of large bankruptcies, so your pension is gone. We're going to deal with this article from the New York Times, December 14, 2003, titled, "And You Thought Pension Funds Were Scary." They're going to deal very briefly with what you think your money is in terms of your health benefit. Only an estimated 5% of American companies offer health benefits, like General Motors, etc. Current company estimate for health care cost is put at $284 billion. The money that the companies that underwrite these health insurance is not there. Another quick article that you do not have dealing with the mutual funds. Your pensions, your health insurance.
Yeah. Watch it.